Okay, good day again, everyone. We've already discussed what VAT is. Now we're going to discuss how VAT is, uh, how VAT will be recorded in the books of accounts. So we're going to use this discussion of the Tax Accounting Center by Gary Pagaspas. No? Okay. Sabi niya dito, value-added tax is imposed upon any persons who, in the ordinary course of business or trade, sells, barters and exchanges, leases goods or properties, renders services, and any person who imports goods. It is an indirect tax, and the amount of VAT may be shifted or passed on to the buyer, transferee, or lessee of goods. So, discuss natin. So, parang all transaction to eh. Sales, barters, exchanges, leases of goods, properties, and renders services. So, lahat covered ng lahat ng business transactions covered ng VAT. It is an indirect tax daw, meaning to say, the one liable to the tax may not be the one who's going to pay it because the VAT may be shifted or passed on to the buyer, transferee, or lessee of the goods. The one liable is the seller, but the one liable will be the seller because it is tax, but the one who's going to pay it will be the buyer or lessee or transferee. So, hindi dapat kung direct tax yan, liable yung seller yung magbabayad. But this time, liable yung seller, pero ang magbabayad ay ang buyer, transferee, or lessee. Okay, the BIR mandated under Revenue Regulation 18-2011 that VAT shall be shown separately on the sales invoice for transactions involving goods or on the official receipts for transaction involving services. So, take note, sales invoice kapag goods ang binenta. Official receipt kapag services ang binenta. Now, the VAT should be indicated separately both in sales invoice and official receipt. Kailangan naka-indicate na yung VAT doon sa mga transaction. Otherwise, the transaction will be subject to the establishment will pay penalties for failure to segregate the amount of VAT in the official receipt and sales invoice. Now, the VAT you pay on purchases is called input VAT. The VAT collected from sales is called output VAT. So, kapag bumili ka, yung VAT na binili mo, ang tawag doon ay input VAT. Kapag nagbenta ka at merong VAT doon sa binenta mo, then that is called output VAT. In computing the VAT due and payable to the Bureau of Internal Revenue, you simply compute as follows. Output VAT from sales less creditable input taxes is equal to VAT due and payable. So, ano yung creditable input taxes? Meron kang binayaran, meron kang binili at meron kang input tax. Pero kasi minsan mag-transact ka sa government, meron silang withholding on VAT. So kung merong withholding on VAT, creditable withholding on VAT pa rin yun. Magko-qualify yun as a deduction from output tax. Okay? So, meron siyang illustration dito. For illustrative purposes, let us assume the following transactions or figures to emphasize VAT journal entries. Let us assume no withholding taxes applies. Ang ibig sabihin, walang sales to government. Oh. Company seller VAT registered, sold, company buyer VAT registered for 200,000, exclusive of 12% VAT, for a total of 224,000. Company sellers purchases amounted to 100,000 exclusive of VAT, or a total of 112,000. So, sale of goods or properties. In the monthly, quarterly, or quarterly VAT returns, the sale of goods is classified into regular sales, zero-rated sales, exempt sales, and sales to government. So, kunyari, regular sales and government sales yan. So, debit to cash, ang entry natin kapag nagbenta will be a debit to cash or accounts receivable, 224,000, and credit sales, 200,000, and credit output VAT, 24,000. So, itong output VAT na to is in the form of liability. We have to remit this to the BIR if there are no input VAT that can be deducted from this. Now, kung zero-rated yan, dahil nga zero-rated, wala yung VAT. Meron siyang debit 200,000 and credit 200,000 sales. So take note that VAT is shown separately through the output VAT. In regular and government sales, VAT is added, while zero rated and exempt sales, no output VAT is imposed. The peculiar in government sales is the treatment of input taxes. So we will we'll discuss that later. So, sa zero-rated transaction, hindi natin nilalagyan ng output VAT kasi nga zero-rated ito. Pero yung input taxes nito can be claimed as refund or tax credit for other tax liabilities. Yun yung bakit yung iba nagpapa-register as VAT kahit na hindi mataas yung sales nila kasi they can claim the input VAT. So, itong zero-rated transactions, hindi sila subject sa VAT. Yung sales nila hindi subject sa VAT. Pero yung purchases nila, kung hindi naman zero-rated yung katransact nila, that will be subjected to VAT, and you call that input taxes, which can be credited or refunded. Okay? Purchases of goods and properties. So, purchases with a 12% VAT, anong entrada? Kunyari, 100,000 yung binili. So, debit, expense, or purchases, or any other asset account. So, kung expense yan, debit mo yung expense. Kung purchases yan, merchandise yan, you debit purchases. If equipment yan, you debit equipment. So, debit mo yung expense, purchases, or asset account by 100, and you credit the input VAT by, you debit also the input VAT. Nagiging part ng cost yun. So, ang input VAT is a debit and an output VAT is a credit. Input VAT is an asset. Output VAT is a liability. So, debit expense, purchases or asset account, debit input VAT, and credit cash or accounts payable. For zero-rated transaction, debit, expense, purchases, or asset account, and credit, cash or accounts payable. Kasi walang VAT yung binilihan mo, edi wala kang VAT na babayaran. The only difference on the above entries applies on the recognition of the input VAT. For VATable purchases, input VAT is recognized separately because it represents an asset that has to be accounted for. Okay? Setting up VAT payable or creditable input VAT. For monthly or quarterly filing of VAT returns, you may either have VAT payable or excess creditable input tax. So, pwedeng malaki yung output VAT kesa sa input. Pagka mas malaki yung output mo, output tax, kesa sa input tax, meron kang VAT payable sa BIR. Pero kung mas malaki yung input tax mo, meaning mas madami yung purchases mo kesa sa sales mo, malaki yung input mo, yung excess ng input sa output will be VAT credit which can be refunded or can be applied to other taxes. So hihingi ka ng VAT refund para sa mga excess ng VAT input. For the first 2 months of the quarter, you use sales, purchases, and related VAT components for the monthly period only. So yung January, February, monthly ang gagamitin na form. For the quarter return, pag sasama-samahin mo na yung tatlo, hindi na monthly VAT form ang gagamitin mo. Kung hindi, quarterly VAT form. So, here is the sample entries daw for the VAT payable. So, meron kang debit na output VAT at meron kang credit na input VAT. So, meron kang VAT due and payable. So, habang nagbebenta ka, you debit the cash, accounts receivable, and credit sales, and credit output VAT payable. Habang bumibili ka, you debit purchases, asset, expenses, and debit input VAT and credit input VAT, and debit input VAT and credit cash or accounts receivable, accounts payable. So, yung at the end of the month, you summarize it. So, yung output VAT na naka-credit sa'yo, i-debit mo para mabura dun sa transaction mo for the month. At yung input VAT mo na naka-debit, i-credit mo. So, mabubura yon dun sa input VAT mo for the month. And then you will have your VAT payable. So, na-recognize mo na magkano or na-record mo na kung magkano yung VAT payable na babayaran mo sa BIR. Ngayon, ang next step will be to pay the BIR, di ba? After mo ma-set up yon, anong mangyayari? Ano ang difference natin dito sa illustration na to? Hmm. 12,000 yung VAT due and payable. So, pagka babayaran na natin yan, anong magiging entrada? Debit, VAT due payable, credit cash. So, ibig sabihin, for the month of January, nabayaran na natin yung ating VAT liability sa BIR. Zero na yung ating VAT payable. Okay? So, merong isa pa siyang illustration dito. Setting up VAT payable, applying prior period creditable input VAT. So kung merong creditable input VAT, prior period pa, meaning to say, last year, meron kang excess input VAT. So, ima-minus mo pa rin yun. I-carry forward mo yun sa subsequent year. Ima-minus mo yun dun sa iyong VAT payable. So, okay. Medyo, ano ba ito comment? Basta, i-summarize natin tong kanyang discussion. Oh, madali lang naman ang VAT eh. Nagbenta ka, may output VAT. Bumili ka, may input VAT. Now, yung difference between output and input will be your VAT payable. So, ang entrada mo habang nagbebenta ka, debit, cash, credit, sales, credit, VAT payable or output VAT. Pareho lang yung output VAT or VAT payable. Ngayon, bumili ka, debit, asset, expense, purchases, credit, debit, input VAT, credit, cash, or accounts payable. Ulit, nagbenta ka, debit, cash, or accounts receivable, credit, sales, credit, output VAT. Bumili ka, debit, asset, purchases, or expenses, debit, input VAT, and credit, cash, or accounts receivable. So, yun yung entrada mo sa pagbenta at sa pagbili. Now, isi-set up mo ngayon at the end of the month, magkano yung VAT payable mo talaga. So, yung isa-summarize mo lahat ng output VAT mo at input VAT mo. So, pag nakuha mo na yung total, kukumputin mo na kung meron kang excess output or meron kang excess input. Kung meron kang excess output, the entry will be debit, debit output tax, credit, okay, compare na lang, i-record, i-close lang muna natin lahat. Lahat ng output tax mo, ide-debit mo. Kasi naka-credit yun, di ba? Yung monthly mo, i-close natin. So, dahil credit yun, ide-debit mo. To close it, debit output tax and credit input tax. So, debit mo yung output tax, credit mo yung input tax, and then the difference will be the output tax payable. Now, what if mas malaki yung input tax? So, dinebit mo yung output tax, kinredit mo yung input tax, mas malaki yung input tax. So, anong mangyayari? Meron kang input tax refundable or input tax creditable. Pag sinabi mong input tax refundable, gusto mong kolektahin from the BIR yung excess input tax. Now, pag sinabi mong input tax creditable, gusto mong i-apply yung tax credit na yon sa susunod na VAT period. Kasi baka mas malaki yung output mo, next period, i-apply mo na lang yung input tax. Ang government, ang sales to government will be subject to withholding tax on VAT. So, kung may withholding tax ang government, kasama pa rin yun sa input tax na ima-minus mo. Kasi you should pay output tax. Winidhold na ng government entity yung amount na yun. So, kailangan ibawas din yun sa babayaran. Kasi sa gobyerno, kunyari, bumili ka ng 500,000. Isa-subject mo ngayon yung government sa VAT na 12%. Pero yung government, babayaran kanya ng minus pa ng VAT depending on the nature of the transaction. Kung service ba yan or goods ba yan. So magkaiba yung withholding nila doon. So yung withhold ng government na VAT will be part of the deduction from the output tax payable. Yun lang yung nakakalito dun sa VAT kung meron kang transaction with the government because the government withholds certain amount of VAT. Dapat ikaw na yung, pagka-transaction mo sa government, ikaw na dapat yung withholding agent eh. Ikaw yung seller, ikaw yung withholding agent ng VAT. Pero when you transact with the government, withholding ka, withholding agent din siya. Withhold mo yung VAT kasi ikaw magbabayad sa BIR. Pero yung government mag-withhold din from you. Parang hinahati yung withholding ng VAT between the government and the seller. So, ganun yung nature pagka government yung ka-transaction. Okay? So, this will be all for VAT. Madali lang, di ba? Let's recap. Nagbenta ka, debit cash or accounts receivable, credit sales, credit output. Bumili ka, debit purchases or asset or expenses, debit input tax and credit, cash or accounts payable. At the end of the month, i-close mo lahat ng input mo and lahat ng output mo. And the difference will either be output VAT payable or input tax creditable or refundable. So, ganun lang kadali yung VAT. If you have questions, then you can PM me so that I'm going to answer your question. That's all for VAT. This will be included in your midterm data. So study well. God bless and good luck.